Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 201, and welcome to what is sadly, tragically, our second and last lecture on antebellum reform. We are, at this point in the semester, examining our second time period. We are examining the antebellum era, the early 1800s, the early 19th century, and we're focusing on the culture of reform that developed in this period. In our first lecture, we looked at the role of religion in reform. We talked about the Second Great Awakening, the impact of Charles Finney, creation of utopian societies. Here, in this lecture, we're going to talk about how the spirit and culture of reform here in the antebellum era helped people come together, forge solidarities and connections, and seek ambitious change through a feminist movement that sought to create equality among the sexes, and an abolitionist movement that sought to end slavery. For this portion of the class, you're reading the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass and his first autobiography, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. So your readings for this section of the class reflect this goal of abolitionism, and we'll talk about abolitionism in the second lecture on antebellum reform. Just in case you totally forgot what we covered in our first lecture, let's recapitulate what we stressed in that first lecture on antebellum reform, where we examined the role of religion. And in those lectures, we talked about how the Second Great Awakening, the message of self-determination, a knowable God, reflected individualism. And certainly central to the culture of reform in the antebellum period is this notion of an individual agent able to know God and make decisions through that second core element of the Second Great Awakening, free will, to improve their life here on earth and to ensure salvation in the next life. That led to things like utopian societies, where individuals believed they could create a perfect world here on earth, and we talked about some prominent examples of that. And I worked hard to testify to utopian societies as, rather than cults, agglomerations of individuals who all made a choice using their free will to live in those fashions. So in our first lecture, we talked about many ways in which reform reflected individualism, which is a key ethic in America in this period of dramatic change in the early 19th century. But in this lecture, we're going to branch out and talk about how individuals who came to understand God through that core element of the Second Great Awakening, the idea of God as knowable, and the other core tenet of Second Great Awakening, free will, imagine that as individuals they could transform not just themselves, but society. And they banded together in like-minded groups, forged connections, and imagined reforming, changing not just the self, but the totality of society. They imagined ambitious change where they could end the most profitable slave regime in human history, create a new America cleansed of that sin of slavery, where blacks and whites are equal, the abolitionist movement. And we'll also see how, as part of this, came the feminist movement, where men and women banded together and imagined they could create a new America where men and women were equal in society under law. So the antebellum age is a period of dramatic transformation in American life, in the economy, in politics, in technology. And as part of that, you have this reform spirit that Ralph Waldo Emerson testified to in our very first slide in our very first lecture last week on the antebellum age, where there's this great hope, this great ambition, there's this great mania spreading through America that the way things are is not how they have to be, that we can change things, that there are problems identified in society, but also there's this firm faith that those problems can be remedied and addressed. And it led to the Second Great Awakening. It led to the popularity of Charles Finney and his message of self-determination, self-reliance. It led to those utopian societies like the Shakers and Oneida. But here in this lecture, we'll talk about how that sensibility of reform united people, allowed them to imagine connections of common grievance and also common visions for reform and change. So that's our focus here in the second lecture, the way in which antebellum reform created these solidarities, these connections, allowing people to imagine themselves as part of a broader, more expansive experience that sought to reform not just the self, but society. We begin that process by focusing on feminism. And the antebellum age, the early 19th century, was a period of budding, growing, intensifying feminism. Now, feminism has always been part of American history. There's nothing more American than feminism. From our very founding, women were integral to the revolutionary process. There were many debates in the early republic about the place of women, and prominent feminists like Abigail Adams and others arguing for greater inclusion of women, a true liberty that would be secured by an equality of the sexes. And then in the early antebellum period, in the decades after the American Revolution, you have the strong, intense feminist period that we will examine here. And then after the Civil War, you get the efforts of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony to secure the right to vote for American women. It leads in the early 20th century to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which allowed at least white women to vote. And then in the 20th century, there were many other efforts by American women, women of color like Dolores Huerta and Rosa Parks and others who advocated for true equality. And of course, that effort continues to this day. So feminism is a continuity in American history. It doesn't just spontaneously erupt in the 1960s and 1970s. And the antebellum period was, in particular, a period of intense feminism where women were rejecting, in many ways, the separate spheres doctrine that prevailed in the early 19th century, along with industrialization. Now, one of the factors that we cited last week in attempting to explain why it is this period, the antebellum period, the early 19th century, the early 1800s, that a reform movement like this develops, why this is an age of reform, why the early 19th century is this period of great mania and enthusiasm for change. One of the factors in that, industrialization, how in northern states in the early 1800s they were slowly but steadily transitioning to an economy rooted in people living in cities, working in factories, selling their time for money. Industrialization is very causal in the antebellum reform era as it aggrandized, magnified many problems, but also pulled people together by concentrating people together in the same social space, allowing ideas to spread, inflect, and influence people. We've already seen that with the way in which Charles Finney proved to be so popular in urban areas where people often felt anxious and unmoored by the changes of this period. We also saw how many of the reform efforts, like those of the Shakers, rejected that new age of the market economy. So industrialization is this key factor in American life in the early 19th centuries. And with industrialization came a separation, a physical separation between home and work, where now you leave your home to go to a factory. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, home and work, same physical space. You lived and you worked on a farm. But in the new industrial age, there's now this physical separation between home and work. You leave your home to work in a factory. You can't create a factory and make it profitable in your own home. Factory labor was concentrated in certain parts of a city. And with it came the separate spheres doctrine, the idea that there are two separate spheres, whereas home and work are now physically separated. It was imagined that the public sphere, the economic sphere, the political sphere, the sphere outside the home is the domain of men. This is an age where the only people who can vote are white men. We talked about the advent of universal white manhood suffrage in our very first lecture on antebellum reform, where now all white men, whether they own property or not, can vote. And so the political sphere was closed to women. Women could not vote. There's this now separation in physical space in regards to economics, with home and work separate. And all this leads to the idea that the domain of the public, the domain of the political, the domain outside the home is the domain of men. It was coded, gendered, male. Whereas the private realm, the familial realm, is the realm of women. Now, this was an ideal, not a lived reality. Women often worked in this period. In fact, the very first industrial workers in America in the 1820s were women, single, unmarried women. Well before men became wage earners working in factories, women worked. And of course, women, even if they didn't work for wages in this period, were involved in the market economy as consumers. So do not confuse the separate spheres doctrine with reality. There's never been an age in American history, even in the 1950s, where men went to work and women stayed home. That's a fiction. Women have always worked in American history outside the home and continue, of course, to this day. So the separate spheres doctrine is not lived reality. It instead was an ideal. However, you can learn a lot about a society through what it does idealize. And what we have idealized here is this notion of a separate sphere for men, including the political realm, and women foreclosed, denied access to that realm. But what happens in this period is women are actively engaged in that public and political realm, even if they don't have the right to vote. This is another way in which the separate spheres doctrine is a falsehood. Not only were women active in the economy as wage earners, workers, consumers, stewards of household economics, women were also very active in the political realm, even if they could not vote. Women were writing. Women were giving lectures. Women were very active in the reform movements of this period, many of them related to the Second Great Awakening. We saw how a woman, Mother Ann Lee, formed this utopian society that attracted thousands of Americans to come and join and live as the Shakers did. So the separate spheres doctrine is further false. It's not lived reality because women were so active in this period. And what it demonstrates is the way in which women are interpolating their subjectivities, their reform efforts into the public realm by giving speeches, by giving public lectures, by writing and trying to influence public opinion and public policy. Women could not vote in this period. They could not cast a ballot and change America through elected representatives that responded to their imperatives. But they could still change America by influencing the public and political culture in these ways. So this is part of the way in which women are attacking the separate spheres doctrine. They're not staying in the private realm. They're very active in this period in trying to change America and influence public policy. Good example of this, Dorothea Dix, who was concerned about asylums in this period. Public asylums in this period of the early republic, the early 19th century, the decades after the American Revolution, were really punitive institutions. They treated people who suffered from mental illnesses as if they were sinners or criminals. So asylums in the early 1800s were really miserable places where people who were suffering from mental illness were abused. It was believed that they were the problem. So they were treated in a very inhumane way. Dorothea Dix argued for reform of asylums. She's going to reform public institutions so that they treat people in a much more humane way. Her argument was if we treat these people in a more humane way, they're more likely to get better. And therefore, they could return to society and be contributors to society. So she argued we have a vested interest in treating people in a more humane way. If we treat them in a more humane way, they'll get better, they'll be able to return to society, they'll be productive members of society. Of course, she also argued we should treat these people in a humane way because that's the right thing to do. So Dorothea Dix couldn't vote. She couldn't even own property in this period. Women had so few political rights in the antebellum age. But she could transform society through her advocacy, through her role as a feminist advocating for the greater inclusion of women, the greater activism of women, in this case seeking to reform a public institution that was failing members of the public. She wanted to reform asylums so they could better respond to the needs of those people who were held in asylums. So there's a lot here in the example of Dorothea Dix. First, it's a good example of the way in which women in this period were very active in public and political life. Dorothea Dix launching this campaign for a reform of asylums. Furthermore, it's very demonstrative of the reform impulse of this age, where there's a problem identified, and Americans, in this case Dorothea Dix, is dedicated to solving that problem, reforming these institutions, so they better respond to the needs not only of the individuals in the asylum, but the broader society. And there's also, of course, an example here where Dorothea Dix is making an argument to that end, to that goal of asylum reform. That's about us. It's about connections. It's about solidarity. What is our focus here in the second lecture examining antebellum reform? The way in which people were urged through the reform era to imagine a sense of mutuality, mutual responsibility. Dorothea Dick's argument, again, was we have a responsibility to these people who are held in asylums to treat them in a humane way. But we as a society benefit from that because they'll get better and they'll be able to be reintegrated into society. So also revealed in the example of Dorothea Dick's is again the broader emphasis of this lecture, the way in which reform efforts, exemplified by Dorothea Dick's, here reveal that sense of connection and solidarity among individuals connected to a broader society, a sense of mutuality, mutual responsibility. Another example of the efforts of women in public life in the reformist era that we're examining here, the early 19th century, can be seen in the Female Moral Reform Society. As one of the efforts in the antebellum age, there was a crusade against prostitution. As cities developed, as they became magnets for people from around the country and around the world, crime and vice and other forms of public license became great causes and concerns in this era. As I've already mentioned, there's the temperance movement in this period, the effort to dissuade people from drinking alcohol, and now there's all this effort to target alcoholism, moral concern. Another concern of this age of reform related to that and the sensibilities of the Second Great Awakening was a concern about prostitution and how cities were seen as dens of prostitution. And so there was this effort to criminalize prostitution and launch a crusade to stamp out what was identified as the moral evil of prostitution. But what the Female Moral Reform Society identified in that effort was that the target was on the female prostitutes. They're the ones who are arrested. They're the ones who are identified as the problem, the scourge. And the men who frequent these prostitutes, who are as equal, if not more, culpable for this problem, go unpunished. So what the Female Moral Reform Society did was it published the names of Johns. It published the names of men who patronized prostitutes who were arrested, and in doing so exposed the double standard of sex, where women are punished for something that men are again equally responsible for. So the effort here was one of public shaming. It was one of exposure, and in a new age of cities, your morality is on display for everyone to judge. That's one of the elements you certainly see here in a more urban America, where people's morality was very much subject to public scrutiny. And so the Female Moral Reform Society published the names of men in newspapers who were guilty of pursuing prostitutes. There's a lot here again in regards to the activism of women, the activism of feminists in this period, and their dedication to creating an equality by targeting this double standard where men were often unpunished during this effort to combat prostitution in American cities. Two key feminists of this period are the Grimkes sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They also very much demonstrate how women, in a period where they can't vote and directly affect politics and political change, could indeed change America in this reformist age through their writings and their lectures. They were dedicated to abolitionism, the most radical of all reform efforts, which we'll talk about in our final slides in the end of this lecture. The Grimke sisters first were drawn to that cause of ending slavery, abolitionism. And they argued in favor of abolitionism by saying all human beings are children of God, all human beings deserve basic liberties. Of course, slavery is the antithesis of that. Slavery is denying people freedom. But through their advocacy for abolitionism, they developed a larger notion of human rights and human equality. They saw many connections between the fate of African Americans who are consigned to real chains, physical chains, as slaves, and the metaphorical chains that befell American women who may not be in bondage, may not be bought and sold, may not be forced into labor as slaves were, but American women also found themselves through these metaphorical chains, these metaphorical limits, denied freedom and equality in an age where women cannot vote, women had few, if any, political rights, where women are denied education, denied opportunities. The Grimkes sisters first were abolitionists, but what often happens, and we'll talk more about this in slides to come, people who are involved in the abolitionist movement become feminists because they see this connection. They see that what they're ultimately arguing for in calling for the end of slavery is equality for all, basic human rights. All human beings born into a state of nature, all human beings identified as children of God deserve to be free, deserve self-determination. Slaves were denied an education. Slaves were denied just reward for their labor, just like American women. So it's not the same, but it's an analogous, it's a comparable status of unfreedom. And so the Grimke sisters became feminists. In 1838, Sarah Grimke published her most influential work, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, where she really mapped out what would become the feminist agenda in the 19th and into the 20th century. Equal rights for women, equal pay. Women who labor should be paid the same as men for the same labor. This remains to this day, now in the 21st century, sadly, a goal yet unachieved, a goal central to feminism, the idea of equal pay for equal work. So the Grimke sisters, Sarah Grimke, in her landmark work here was really sketching out what remains the agenda of the American feminist movement, centered again on this notion of equality. They rejected the separate spheres doctrine. That's not an ideal. We don't want to live in an age where half of the population is confined to the private realm. Women have a role in society. Women deserve education, equality, opportunity. So Sarah Grimke, Angelina Grimke may have begun their public career as abolitionists, but they became feminists, advocating for a common cause of equality. Now, both of them retire from public life by the 1840s, no longer publish, no longer advocate in this fashion, no longer write, but they left in their wake a whole generation of American women and men who were influenced by their writing. So, though they themselves were no longer active, their ideas were out there. And one of the key ideas for you to take away from these lectures concerns the way in which ideas in this period can infect, influence, when they're printed and can be read by thousands of people. That creates change. That creates a movement. Ideas circulate, they influence, they infect. People are now concentrated in cities. When you give a lecture, hundreds of people can hear and then go off and tell others about what they heard. When you print something, this is an age of the steam press now, where the steam engine, which was being used to power boats and railroads and power looms and spinning jennies and factories, were also being used to power the printing press. And so that meant Grimke's works, the writings of this period, could be mass-produced and circulate. And so they themselves were no longer active in the feminist and abolitionist movement by the 1840s, but it didn't really matter because they left behind them these written works. They left behind them a generation of American men and women who were inspired by their work and carried it on. Think back to the Lepore book and the power, the cumulative, lasting power of writing, how it cements a moment and then lives on in further moments as generations come to that work anew. Well, Sarah and Angelina Grimke may not be writing after 1840, but their writings were already published and able to circulate, influence, and infect this broadening feminist movement. Margaret Fuller is a key figure in American culture in the early 19th century because she stands at the nexus of two key movements, feminism and transcendentalism. I introduced Ralph Waldo Emerson to you in our first lecture as a way of getting our feet wet, getting into the antebellum reform era with his observation in 1841 that never before in human history had the doctrine of reform been so active and alive. He testified to the enthusiasm for reform in this period. Ralph Waldo Emerson, along with others, including Margaret Fuller, was the founder of a uniquely American philosophy, transcendentalism, which has its own place in the Antebellum Reform era. Emerson was the founder, along with Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, of this uniquely American philosophy. So Margaret Fuller was a founding member of the Transcendentalist movement, but she saw a connection between Transcendentalism, this philosophy, and the cause of feminism. Transcendentalism argues that the quest of human freedom requires you to break free from the bonds, limits imposed upon you by society. You must transcend to a higher plane of independence and autonomy. Transcendentalists argue that from the moment of your birth, you're told what rules to follow, what God to worship, what flag to salute. Transcendentalists argue you're taught to follow the rules, do what you're told, fit in, become a good little cog in the machine. And you have a choice. You could either live in that fashion and give up your freedom, or transcend this world by challenging the dogma, the doctrines, the rules that you have inherited. So Transcendentalism is all about the idea of society as ensnaring, the idea of society as a trap designed to deny you your true self and individualism. Well, Margaret Fuller, who wrote and helped advance the Transcendentalist movement, saw in that critique of society something that really applied to American women who were subject to so many bonds, demands, strictures that limited their independence. They were told to get married and dedicate their life to the private realm. The separate spheres doctrine prevailed, this idea that the public, the political, was foreclosed to women. So this is the overlap for Fuller between Transcendentalism, a philosophy that rejects the limits and bonds imposed upon individuals, that requires you to go on an individual quest for your own freedom and truth, where you decide what rules to follow, where you decide what is just, worthy, and beautiful. Fuller saw a direct connection between that way of thinking and feminism, which called upon American women to be free from the limits imposed upon their gender. Margaret Fuller had a brief but important career as a public writer. Her writing was published in magazines and newspapers. She was the editor of the Dial, the editor of the New York Tribune. So again, Margaret Fuller couldn't vote. Margaret Fuller could not influence politics through casting a ballot, through advocacy for a particular political party or movement, because the political parties of this period were not responsive to American women. But she could still influence American life through her writing. So it's a good example of, again, feminism, the effort to assail the separate spheres doctrine, and the way in which women were so key to this age of antebellum reform. Margaret Fuller's most important work, her magnum opus, was published in 1845, right here in the throes and thickets of the antebellum era. It's titled Woman in the 19th Century. And she argues for the emancipation of women, for the equality of the sexes, that women should not be limited in their pursuit of education, of employment, of thought, intellectual pursuit. Everything should be open for all individuals who are free, who are born in a state of nature with natural rights, who are equal in the eyes of God. Again, Fuller in 1845 was enunciating what would be the driving imperative, the driving agenda of feminism into the 20th and now 21st century. So Margaret Fuller was a very influential figure as one of the founders of a uniquely American philosophical school, Transcendentalism. But again, for her, Transcendentalism was deeply interlaced with feminism in their calls for the liberation of individuals from undue, unjust bonds, strictures, rules imposed upon individuals. Margaret Fuller had sadly a brief moment in the spotlight, as she would die at the age of 40 in 1850 in a shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea. Fuller was convinced that she could never meet a man in the United States who would treat her as an equal, that even the most enlightened, the most feminist, the most woke, we could say, American man would never treat her as an equal. He was so polluted by the prevailing patriarchy in America. Even the most enlightened feminist American man would still see her as inferior. So she was convinced she could never marry an American man and enjoy a life of equality. She instead married an Italian man, and soon after their marriage, they both died in a tragic shipwreck in the Mediterranean. So we were robbed of perhaps many more decades of Margaret Fuller's contributions to these various efforts. But certainly her brief career demonstrates the role of feminism in this period, the way in which American women are coming together in like-minded groups as the aggrieved people of society who are subject to inequality and demanding change. Very demonstrative of feminism, antebellum reform, and again our focus in the second lecture examining antebellum reform group movements. Movements of people who are bound together, solidarities. What the Grimkes sisters, Dorothea Dix, and Margaret Fuller were advocating for was a common body of problems that afflicted American women who were denied equality, denied opportunity, and they advanced change. They advanced a reform agenda designed to remedy that. The most important event in the antebellum feminist movement occurred in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, 1848 is a year that fascinates historians in the United States because so many things happen in that one year. It's the year that the U.S.-Mexican War comes to an end, and a treaty is signed that gives the United States what was 25% of Mexico. California, part of what will be Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, all of Texas. So in 1848, America acquired a continental empire that now spanned from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Also in 1848, gold would be discovered in California. It would start the gold rush, which would forever transform California. 1848 was a presidential election year. And also in 1848, you get this key event in Seneca Falls, New York, where abolitionists and feminists met together in the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, I've mentioned many times throughout this lecture that there's often an overlap between the abolitionist movement and the feminist movement, the two key movements we're examining here in our second lecture on antebellum reform. Feminists were often abolitionists, and abolitionists were often feminists. It wasn't a perfect overlap. There are many controversies in the reform movements of this period as to what to pursue first. Do we need to end slavery first and then advocate for the equality of the sexes? Many people made that argument. There were many abolitionists who weren't feminists, and there were many feminists who weren't abolitionists. So it's not a perfect overlap, but the two often did overlap in the way I explained with the Grimkes sisters, where there was this common language of aggrievement. Now, aggrievement, again, is key to reform eras like antebellum reform. You don't have this great enthusiasm, this great wave of reform efforts unless people feel as if there are problems, unless people feel aggrieved. For a reform movement, you need, again, two things. A sense of aggrievement, a sense that something is wrong, and then a firm faith that those problems can be remedied. When abolitionists argued against the evil of slavery and for the abolition of enslaved people, as you can read in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, when Douglass makes these very arguments, he's talking about a universal human state where all human beings deserve to be free, deserve to pursue an education, pursue a life of their own making, have control over their bodies. That's huge to the abolitionist movement, that slaves are human beings and they should not be locked up. They should not be beaten and raped. You see a lot of the violence of slavery in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, and he's arguing for the most basic of all human rights, life, bodily integrity, control over your very existence. So abolitionism was all rooted in this notion that human beings deserve to be free, they deserve to control over their bodies, control of their self-development, control of their destiny. And all of that argument, though originally formulated to argue against the evil of slavery, translated well to feminism because women were denied education, denied reward for their labor. In this period, women had no private property rights. If they did earn wages, as most women did, their wages were the legal property of either their husband, if they were married, or their father, if they were unmarried. Women were denied an education. They were denied just desert for their labor, as their wages could be confiscated by the men in their lives. They were unfree individuals. They could not vote. They had no political power. Now, again, it's not the exact same as being a slave, but there's a way in which there's a common aggrievement, a common unfreedom for both American women and enslaved people. But more importantly, the argument against slavery was rooted in a notion of human equality, human dignity, the right of all people to be free, and that could spark in one's mind an argument for the emancipation of women. And so the Seneca Falls Convention was rooted in the anti-slavery ethic, the anti-slavery arguments of universal human equality and freedom. And in 1848, men and women met together in Seneca Falls Convention, many of them veterans of the abolitionist movement, to establish an agenda for the emancipation of American women in line with this notion of universal human equality, freedom, and dignity that, again, was often deeply informed by abolitionism. As part of that agenda, they called for the right to vote, suffrage, that American women should be able to vote, that voting rights should be for all, regardless of sex. So the Seneca Falls Convention is part of this long-standing effort, which continues to this day, so that all individuals would have the right to vote. In the 19th century, the most important marker of citizenship was the right to vote. Voting meant more than just choosing a candidate and trying to affect political change. Voting meant you were an American. It was a badge of citizenship. It was a marker of inclusion. One of the central debates in American history, from our origins through today, is this question of who is an American? What do we mean by the first three words of the Constitution? We the people. We are having that debate right now in 2020. But it's part of a long enduring debate. In the 19th century, one of the answers to that question of who was an American, perhaps the most important, well, people who could vote. They're the citizens of this nation. It was a badge, a marker of citizenship, and women said, we're Americans too. We're human beings. We deserve freedom, equality, opportunity, but we're also citizens of this nation, and we deserve the marker of citizenship. So the call for suffrage was more than just empowering women to affect political change, to give them the right to vote and influence public policy and who would represent them in public life. It was also very much about us as citizens. We too are under that banner of we the people. At the Seneca Falls Convention, the delegates to this convention wrote up a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments. Declaration of Sentiments. Basically their manifesto, their argument, their sentiments. And it was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, almost word for word, although modified to reflect their vision of feminism, equality of the sexes, equality for all. For example, when they got to the portion of the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, they changed it to all people are created equal, which very much reflects feminism, but also the abolitionist ethic that was behind this as well. So at the Seneca Falls Convention, they drafted this document, which again was really their statement, the Declaration of Sentiments. And they pulled upon the Declaration of Independence as their model for this document, updating it in many ways for 1848, updating it for the feminist cause. And this too demonstrates the way in which the Declaration of Sentiments, the Seneca Falls Convention, and the broader feminist movement was about citizenship, equality, that vision of women as also under that banner of we the people. We are stressing here in the second lecture the way in which antebellum reform not only reflected individualism, as we summarized in our first lecture, but a sense of us, solidarity, connection, group, society. And that's very, very demonstrative here demonstrated in the Seneca Falls Convention, because the men and women who participated in this convention were not just saying women are human beings, equal, who deserve to be free, to vote. They're saying we're citizens. And they were drawing upon the symbol of America's founding, that foundational document, the Declaration of Independence, and in doing so saying that revolution, which began in 1776 when men authored and signed this document, belongs to us too. We are heirs, we are legatees to that revolution, which continues on in the cause of universal human equality, equality for all should be equal, we should reform all barriers, obstacles that prevent equality for men and women and for all human beings, as again, so many of these delegates were themselves abolitionists. So the Seneca Falls Convention is this key moment, certainly in the history of feminism in America, certainly in the history of antebellum reform, but I would argue in the totality of American history. It's one of the most important moments because it demonstrates people who are denied freedom and equality saying, I too am an American, I too am a human being, I too am a citizen, and I deserve to be free. I deserve to have the markers of freedom. You could see here the list of delegates to the Seneca Falls Convention, most of them women, but also many men. Many of them were themselves advocates of not just feminism, but abolitionism. This marks a call for universal human equality for all. And though it would take many, many decades before at least white women would be able to vote, many more decades for women of color to vote, this would establish that agenda, that driving imperative. Change comes slowly in America, sadly, tragically. But the delegates to the Seneca Falls Convention nudged that change a little bit further down the road in the cause of equality for all. We conclude this lecture, and we conclude our look at antebellum reform with the most remarkable and ambitious reform movement of this period. Abolitionism. I've saved the most remarkable, ambitious of these reform movements for last. Abolitionism. There develops here in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, a movement to abolish slavery. And, once abolished, create a new America where blacks and whites are equal. Abolitionists had two twin drives. Yes, they wanted to abolish slavery, but that's not all. They also wanted to, once slavery is abolished, create something that had never existed before. An America where blacks and whites are equal. Think back to everything you've learned in this class. The first slaves arrive in 1619, almost at the very beginning of English America. Over the course of the next 200 plus years, the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history, predicated on dehumanizing African Americans, develops. And then, in the 1830s, these guys come along, the abolitionists, and say, we're going to end all that, and we're going to create a new America that finally lives up to its ideals of freedom and equality for all, where blacks and whites are equal. So that's what I mean by saving the most ambitious and remarkable reform movement for last, abolitionism. Another thing that makes abolitionism so remarkable is it really has no precedent. Because prior to abolitionism, prior to the 1830s, the only anti-slavery movement in America that existed was the colonization movement, which is the exact opposite of abolitionism. Colonization was an effort to send emancipated slaves or free blacks to Africa, to acquire land in Africa as a colony and send former slaves or free blacks to Africa to deport them. That is the opposite of abolitionism. Abolitionism was the idea that we're going to end slavery and then create a new America under law, in society, where blacks and whites are equal. We're going to live side by side. We're all equal Americans. Colonization is the opposite of that. It imagines an America for whites and whites only by purging the nation of African Americans. Now, as we stressed many, many times, in the early 1800s, northern states are industrializing. They're shifting to a very different economy centered on people living in cities, working in factories, selling their time for money. As a result, northern states ended slavery as they transitioned to that manufacturing industrial economy. With the end of slavery came necessarily the growth of a free black population. Basically, this takes place by northern states passing laws that said all existing slaves, they're still slaves, and they'll be slaves for life. But their children will not be condemned to slavery, that they're not born into slavery, so that over time you'd have the birth and growth of a free black population. What was the response to that? Colonization. Colonization was the idea that, well, we're going to deport, remove these free blacks so that the only people are whites, to preserve a white-only America. So, with the end of slavery in northern states, there was the birth of this colonization movement, which is the only movement prior to abolitionism to accept the end of slavery. Okay, we're going to end slavery as we transition to this new economy of industrialization. But as we do so, we're going to purge the nation of the reminders of slavery, its African American population. We're going to say to these people, you may no longer be slaves, but you'll never be Americans. And to that end, we're actually going to remove you from the borders of the United States. There's obvious analogy here to Indian removal. Think back to our lectures on the Jacksonian era, how in the 1830s, in this period, the Antebellum era, a law was passed that called for the physical removal of tens of thousands of people who weren't white, Native Americans, leading to the Trail of Tears. Well, in the same period, there's this scheme to rid America of its African American population by physically removing them to Africa, to preserve an image of we the people, of us for whites and whites only. Colonization failed. It never worked. Land was secured in Africa, in West Africa, which is the modern day, in the 21st century, nation of Liberia. If you look at a map of Africa, there on the west coast of Africa is this country, Liberia. That was the land that was acquired by the American Colonization Society as a dumping ground for African Americans as part of this effort to create a white-only America. The capital of Liberia, the capital of that nation today, is the city of Monrovia, named after the then, in the early 1800s, President of the United States, James Monroe. So the history of colonization is right there on the map if you know where to look. But this never works. Why? Because African Americans didn't want to live in Africa. They were Americans. They were born here, and they wanted to be Americans, equal, free. So very few African Americans take up the opportunity to go to Africa. I mean, it would be like going to Mars. They have no connection to Africa. They were born here. They think of themselves as Americans. Why would they want to go to Africa? It wasn't a product of the hopes and volition of African Americans. It was a product of the hopes and volition of white Americans who wanted to remove African Americans. And what makes this remarkable is that's the only anti-slavery movement in America prior to abolitionism. The colonization movement, which again aspired to an America for whites only. And then, out of nothing, comes abolitionism, beginning in the 1830s. This final reform movement that we examine here in our final slides, which, as I said earlier, was dedicated to two intertwined goals. End slavery, abolish slavery, hence the term abolition, abolish slavery, and create a new America where blacks and whites are equal. How do we account for the origins of such a radical and remarkable movement that sought to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history? and create a new America that has yet to exist where blacks and whites are equal? Well, part of the origins of the abolitionist movement, coming out of nowhere as there really wasn't a precedent, part of the origin stemmed from the Second Great Awakening. So here it is again, right? Keep showing up in all these lectures because it is at the heart of so many movements and developments in this period. Second Great Awakening, again, was rooted in two core assertions. God is knowable and free will, meaning you, the individual, could know God, and you, the individual, have free will. And we've seen in our most recent lecture how that is key to the Reform era. Abolitionists said, we know God, and God abhors slavery. God would never accept the idea of enslaving his own creation, his own people, his own children. And we have free will. And we're going to use that free will to end slavery. So part of the origins of abolitionism comes from the religious basis behind the movement sparked by the Second Great Awakening and its core doctrines of a knowable, understandable God, a morality that can be known and revealed to you, and the imperative of free will, that you must make a choice. You're either working in the cause of God or you're working against God. Abolitionists always argued that there's only two choices. You're either working to end slavery or you're helping slavery. There's no middle ground. There's no gray area. It's, again, absolutist in that free will doctrine and way of thinking that we've talked about. That's why abolitionists every day work to end slavery. That's why they helped slaves run away. That's why they offered their homes as stops on the Underground Railroad. That's why they broke the law and helped slaves be free. Later in the class, we'll talk about some very famous examples of abolitionists using revolutionary violence, killing people, in order to end slavery or free slaves. So abolitionists were really rooted in that notion of free will and its absolutist calculus that you were either working to end slavery or you're working to support slavery. But abolitionism wasn't solely rooted in religion. There was a lot of secular influence as well. Part of the secular influence came from the Declaration of Independence. Here it is again. As abolitionists also claimed its universal ideals of natural rights, all men are created equal, as part of their argument, rationale, and goals of abolitionism. Abolitionists revered the Declaration of Independence with its universal Lockean notions of natural rights, and they hated, loathed the Constitution. In the story of American history that abolitionists argue and develop, the Declaration of Independence is what we could have been. In July of 1776, we signed this document that expressed our goal to create a republic based on freedom and equality and democracy. We fought a revolution for those goals and aims, but after the revolution, we instead ratified a document, the Constitution, written by slave owners to benefit slave owners, that locked into law the system of slavery. That's the story of American history according to abolitionists in the 1830s and 1840s. We could have been this, but we became this. We aspired to a universal freedom, but we sinned. We bit the apple. And instead formed a republic rooted in slavery. What abolitionists hoped to do was to get us back to what we could have become, to return us to that revolutionary moment of the Declaration and truly fulfill that promise that for now has gone unfulfilled. So abolitionists were deeply influenced by the secular ideals of the Declaration of Independence, Lockean notions that come out of the Enlightenment of a universal humanity, natural rights. They said America claimed to be an exercise in liberty but has failed. Instead, it turned around and wrote and ratified a document, Constitution, that has made America unequal. The great goal of abolitionists was to get us back to what we could have been and finally fulfill that dream unfulfilled. So that's part of the secular basis for abolitionism. The other non-religious secular basis came from the market revolution, industrialization, all those economic trends in northern states in this period. As we've talked about, the market revolution, the industrial revolution, was really rooted in this idea that hard work pays, right? Show up on time, be temperate, be frugal, maximize your wage, maximize your freedom, maximize your opportunity, be independent in charge of your life. Tap into the new energies and opportunities of this age of wage labor. The market revolution, industrialization were rooted in that idea that labor is valuable. Labor should be rewarded. That if you work hard, you should be rewarded. That if you work hard, you will be rewarded. That hard work profits, and that labor is valuable and should be rewarded. That maximizing the wage of earners in this period was a way of maximizing their freedom. Well, slavery is the opposite of that way of thinking. Slavery says your labor is worthless. It's worth nothing. You get nothing for your labor. And that ran counter to the ideals of the market revolution, industrialization, wage labor, that said labor is inherently valuable. And from that, Northerners could argue that blacks, slaves in the South, also deserve reward for their labor. Their labor is valuable too. They could also argue that wage labor should be the rule for all. If you see wage labor as emancipatory, freeing, the thing that makes you free, that allows you to maximize your freedom, you seek it for all as the norm, as the only labor system. And that would lead to, in part, the abolitionist argument to abolish slave labor. So there's a religious basis that comes out of the Second Great Awakening, and then there's this secular basis rooted in the Enlightenment ideals enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the economic changes in northern states associated with the market revolution and industrialization. And from that comes abolitionism, which had two intertwined goals: end slavery now, because it's inherently evil. We are going to use our free will as servants of God here on earth to abolish this evil of slavery. Now, as we'll talk about in some lectures to come, there are other arguments against slavery in this period that argue, well, slowly over time, slavery will die out because the future is industrialization, the future is wage labor, and so eventually the South will be dragged into that future. Abolitionists took a different approach. They said slavery ends now, because every day going forward with slavery is a stain upon our collective soul. It is a sin that all of us are complicit in. As we'll talk more about in lectures to come, abolitionists always argued that we're all guilty. You don't have to be a slave owner. You don't have to be an overseer with a whip. You don't have to be a slave trader. Everyone is guilty, and therefore everyone must work to end immediately, now, abolish slavery. Not slowly, not over time. It ends now. In the 1830s, these guys come along and they say, we're going to end slavery. We're going to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history. We're going to end something that has been part of our history from our very beginnings. But that's not all, history fans. Abolitionists also argued that once we end slavery, we're going to also create a new America where blacks and whites are equal. Think back to everything you have learned in this class up until this moment. All of American history since 1619 was dedicated to creating a racial divide between black and white. We talked about that in our very first lecture on slavery, how beginning in the 1620s, almost immediately after enslaved Africans arrive, laws are established that have a racial divide, that treat people differently under law based on race. And that only amplifies and continues over the next 200 years. And then here come these guys and say, oh, that ends. We're going to end slavery, and then we're going to create something that has never existed before, an America that finally lives up to its ideals of equality and freedom for all. This is some pretty ambitious stuff here. And maybe we could find some hope here. It's tough to find hope in 2020, I know. There's a lot of things to be worried about, a lot of things to be pessimistic about. But maybe we could find some inspiration from these dreamers, the abolitionists, who come along in the 1830s and argue, as we've summarized now, slavery ends now. We're going to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history, and we're going to create a new America where under law, blacks and whites are equal. As we will see in lectures to come, I promise we're going to get there. Many who founded this movement in the 1830s will live to see it. In 1865, we abolished slavery. And soon after, an amendment is added to the Constitution that guarantees equal protection of law. Now, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, but we do ratify the 13th Amendment in 1865 ending slavery, and we do ratify a 14th Amendment in 1868 that demands equal protection, equal under law for all. Point here is what seemed like an impossible dream, a quixotic, impossible, romantic effort in the 1830s. You guys are going to end slavery? Good luck with that, right? That impossible dream is realized. And so maybe there's some hope here for us dreamers of today. In the 1830s, 1840s, abolitionists come along and they aspire to not only ending slavery, but once slavery is abolished, once we are cleansed of that original sin, there's a chance for redemption, resurrection. We can be redeemed and resurrected as a nation where all are equal. In the second lecture, we're talking a lot about connections, solidarity, a sense of us. That's also at the heart of antebellum reform, along with the individualism. And in the case of abolitionism, it's the most remarkable sense of solidarity of all, because abolitionism, in this effort to end slavery and create a new America where blacks and whites are equal, was rooted in a common humanity. We're all human beings. We're all children of God. We all deserve to be rewarded for our labor. We all deserve a chance to live as free individuals. What undergirded abolitionism was the most remarkable, expansive sense of us possible. We're all human beings. It is a sense of us, the public, Americans, people, human beings, that encompasses all of us. A key force in advocating for abolitionism was a newspaper published for the first time in 1831, The Liberator. There would be many newspapers in the abolitionist movement, but this was really one of the first, and as a result would really serve as a nucleus, a center, an institution of sorts for the abolitionist movement that was often very captious. Members of the abolitionist movement often disagreed, argued with each other. They weren't a monolith. They often disagreed about tactics, disagreed about strategies, disagreed about ways of persuasion, the quickness by which their goal would be achieved. But one thing that kept abolitionists sort of rooted and grounded was the publication of The Liberator, which was first published in 1831. It would soon flood the nation with its revolutionary call for ending slavery and advocating for a brand new America, resurrected, reborn, where blacks and whites are equal. Truly an ambitious reform agenda that imagined this notion of, again, collective equality, the equality of all. The Liberator called for the immediate end of slavery in accordance with the abolitionist vision that slavery must end now as an evil that we are all guilty of. They published the accounts of runaway slaves, like Frederick Douglass and others, which again added to this argument for slavery as evil and demanding immediate end. Also, publishing the accounts of slaves served to humanize enslaved people, allow white readers to relate to the enslaved, see them as equals, build that sense of connection, solidarity that again is at the heart of abolitionism and at the heart of the reform movements we're examining here in our second lecture. examining these reform movements, where again, the ultimate solidarity is one of human equality, human connection. And related to that was the call on the pages of the Liberator for a crusade to be advanced by all to end an evil that, again, we are all guilty of. So the Liberator very much reflects abolitionism as, again, a group movement rooted in a common sense of us, a common solidarity, where we all identify this common evil of slavery, and we are all implicated in that evil, and therefore have to be part of an effort to rid America of this evil in the name of a common humanity, in the name of a common claim to freedom. We're all children of God. We are all equal in the eyes of God. So there are so many ways in which the Liberator reflects this ethos of abolitionism, which is really the ethos of the antebellum reform movement we're stressing here, of connection and solidarity. William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of the Liberator, was a provocateur of sorts. He broke the law. He encouraged slaves to run away. He used his own home as a stop on the Underground Railroad, where enslaved people could find safe harbor. He encouraged others to break the law. Abolitionism had no respect for slavery, and certainly no respect for the laws that undergirded slavery. He also burned copies of the Constitution, arguing that he was not bound to that body of laws because it was written by slave owners to protect slavery. Instead, Garrison again appealed to higher law, the higher ideals of the Declaration of Independence, a common sense of humanity. For this, Garrison was often called a terrorist for encouraging people to break the law. He was often called un-American for burning copies of the Constitution. But Garrison always replied to that, I'm the most American of all, because again, I'm trying to get us back to our roots, our founding, the universal notions of freedom that are at the heart of the Declaration of Independence, part of that element of abolitionism where they hated the Constitution and loved the Declaration of Independence. And we saw earlier about how with the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Independence could be this center, this common core of ideals for advocating feminism, abolitionism, both rooted in a common sense of us as free individuals. This image here appeared on the front page of every copy of the Liberator. A black man in chains, effectively naked, down on his knees, staring up at God and saying, am I not a man? Am I not a brother? Am I not a human being, a brother in Christ? Of course, for abolitionists, the answer to that was an emphatic yes. These are human beings. They deserve freedom, equality. This is a moral crusade that we must all embrace. This evil of slavery is going on right now in your country, in your name. What are you going to do about it? A call to action, a call to arms, to end this evil, rooted again in a common sense of us. Now, at the same time, in the early 19th century, the South is becoming more committed to slavery than ever before. There's the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, the effort to expand slavery, and that was all rooted in a very different notion of freedom, that rather than universal, expansive, applicable to all, was confined to white men. The slave culture, slave society that develops alongside the expansion of slavery in the South in the same period, the early 19th century, was rooted in a notion of freedom that was only the province of white men. Southerners argue not everyone is free, not everyone should be free, and not everyone is equal. Freedom and equality are for white men and white men only. It's very demonstrative in many ways of the themes we stressed in our first few lectures as we examined the colonial period and the frontier battles of that period that argued that freedom, manifest destiny, was for white men and white men only. So that was the image of freedom at the heart of the slave economy and culture, very different than the vision of freedom advanced by feminists and abolitionists. And ultimately, America is headed, as a result, on a collision course that will lead to a civil war in the midpoint of the 19th century. And after the midterm exam, in our next time period, we'll examine the post-Civil War period of the late 19th century and change our focus to changes in the economy and in particular to the consumer economy and culture in that age. So it's important to note that the abolitionist movement, with its very ambitious effort to end slavery, ran headlong into a very different notion of freedom that was much more limited and provincial, and that leads to a civil war. But in this lecture, we've examined abolitionism and feminism as part of the broader culture of reform, alongside the efforts we talked about last week in religion, all part of the way in which Americans imagine dramatic change in this period for both individuals and groups and society.